All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back. I got to do this last year, a wonderful little conference. I'm very excited to be back at it. One complaint, it is 5:10 in the morning, where I am right now. My kids are right out there. My wife is down the hall. They're probably going to wake up and hear me talking about accessibility and AI-powered search. What everyone wants to talk about all the time now is AI at all points of all times. But anyway, hi, I'm Corey Vilhauer. I am Director of Strategy at Blend Interactive. We're a Umbraco shop in the United States, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, actually. I'm also author of the Web Project Guide, which is a book that helps non-developers and non-designers sort of understand the world of web projects and workflow. And I want to talk today at 5:10 in the morning about sort of that combination of writing for accessibility and how that really ties into what we're seeing as far as like writing for this new generation of search. But first, I want to talk about country music in the 1990s for for good reasons. For those who are maybe too young to remember the music scene, which I found out was 35 years ago, here's a quick catch up. For decades, record charts in the United States, at least, were dominated by like rock and rock adjacent artists. And this is because for decades, record charts were compiled by just calling people. They would call radio stations, they would call record stores, and they would ask, hey, what's selling? And these radio stations and these record stores were often rock and rock adjacent themselves. So the charts really reflected a very specific type of perceived mainstream music. And then in 1991, something called SoundScan was introduced. And what SoundScan did is it essentially changed data collection from this kind of weird straw poll system to actually using sales data based on UPC codes to determine what was selling. And immediately there was this massive shift in the charts. Suddenly the people who paid attention to all these charts saw that metal and hip hop and especially country music were huge markets in the United States. And as a result, programmers and record stores really leaned into these new profit centers. Even more suddenly, country music was a viable, top shelf, popular genre of music. And we always knew somebody like Garth Brooks was a huge act, but this really cemented it, and it led the US into a period where country music had become mainstream music. And this was really great news for a lot of country artists, but there was one major country artist who wasn't riding this wave. Despite 40 years of work up to that point and one of the most recognizable voices in American music, he still found himself with no label support and no radio play. And that was Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash was old. He was in his 60s. He did not fit the polished, sort of like mainstream Nashville sound. The consensus really with Johnny Cash was that his moment had passed. And so country radio would not touch him. And this could have been curtains for Cash, except for one fateful night while performing in late 1992 at Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert in Madison Square Garden. A new ally was watching. And that's this guy. This is Rick Rubin. If you don't know who he is, you probably know what he has done. At the time, he was known for producing hip hop and hard rock. He was there for the Beastie Boys. He was the Run DMC's producer, Slayer. He had absolutely no country credentials whatsoever, but he heard something in Johnny Cash. And unlike country radio, he didn't hear a washed up country singer. He heard someone who had always known how to get to the truth of a song. And so Rick Rubin asked to help produce Johnny Cash's next album. Over the next several years, they collaborated on a handful of albums that are really, they're now called the American recordings, that for the label that they were on. That would really become some of the most critically acclaimed albums that Cash ever made. And while they didn't really like return him to country radio or commercial prominence, they did pull him out of a cultural wasteland. And really what happened is that Johnny Cash's profile shifted from being like an old country crooner to becoming a generational spokesperson. He became a hero to a new alternative crowd. And it wasn't due to anything Rick Rubin did other than trusting in Johnny Cash's version. So ultimately, an unlikely ally helped confirm the hard work that Cash had built and made the sound really land with modern audiences. And if you're asking, yes, this is a metaphor. Accessibility practitioners, especially those who have an interest in plain language and writing for accessibility, we know what it feels like to be Johnny Cash in 1993. We've been making the case for accessible writing for years, for clear headings and for plain language and for like the general idea that content should say what it means. We've brought these arguments and we've shown the data and we've sat in meetings and we've often still struggled to move this work up the priority list. And then GEO showed up. And suddenly, this idea of generative engine optimization arrives from the world of AI search, and it arrives about as far from the accessibility community as Rick Rubin was from Nashville. It comes with its own vocabulary and it comes with its own consultants and it has its own like share of bad LinkedIn thought leadership posts, but it arrives with this like core recommendation that sounds very familiar. When you write for GEO, you should fight for clear headings, and you should fight for plain language, and you should fight for the general idea that content should say what it means. Writing for accessibility suddenly has this unlikely ally, and today I want to talk about that overlap, and specifically about how we can use it to sort of sell accessible writing through the utility of AI-friendly writing, to sort of like sell a new road to the same destination. So first, we'll touch on what accessible writing is looking for, and then we'll touch on how GEO sort of discovered the same thing separately and on its own. And then we'll dive into a few patterns that work for both accessibility and for GEO, and wrap up by talking about how this comes across when we're prioritizing it in those important rooms with leadership and with budget. So let's get into it. First, I want to start with a really simple truth. When we optimize a site for accessibility, we're not optimizing for one thing. This is an accessibility conference, so we all know this. We're optimizing really for that entire spectrum of permanent and temporary and situational disability, from somebody whose eyes may have been dilated to someone with a broken arm, to somebody who has low cognitive understanding of language, and to somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing. We really ultimately then split accessibility work into two areas. We are looking at the idea of structural accessibility, which is what developers and designers really often own. This is your code, your navigation models, your color, your design, and the technical architecture of how a page is ultimately built. A lot of accessibility discussion lands in this space, but there's an entire other side, which is editorial accessibility, which is the words themselves and how they're organized and whether they carry enough meaning to be understood. This is really the purview of the editorial team. And it's where all of those gray areas of accessibility really start to crop up. And they crop up because editorial work is really, really hard to get right. But obviously we have to get it right. We have to get it right because the editorial side of accessibility holds its own importance. How we structure the words that we create inside of all those little fields in our CMS matters to those who use those words as a kind of navigation model. So while we think of accessibility and navigation as a matter of mega menus and skip to content links, in reality, every element on a page can become part of navigation. Screen readers allow users to move through just the headings of a page. Users on mobile devices may need to scan content really, really quickly to be able to make those decisions on the go. And so we ultimately build secondary and tertiary pathways through our content by nature of how we are writing the content itself. And as we see in this like sort of shifty screenshot, assistive devices are really designed to help with those pathways. And this means that we can't just assume that our content is being read like a book from top to bottom, where that nobody's skipping any words on our pages. And what's more, this editorial focus is a reminder that accessibility covers more than just physical and mental disabilities. Accessible content really it helps those who speak languages outside of our own and more easily translate all of this content into their language. And it helps those with lower reading comprehension better understand the meaning in the text. So there's a lot to learn here. And the practice of editorial accessibility has always known it. This is essentially the core, which is to make everything as easy to scan as possible with as little confusion as possible. The disconnect here is really twofold, but both of those folds point to the same problem, which is that language is very hard to measure and language is very hard to judge. So if we look at a page that's being validated through a tool like Wave, we find a ton of information about what can be changed on the structural level. But if we take away the structured content and look at just the written body areas, we find there's really nothing that can be tested in this traditional space. And this is normal. It's completely understandable. It's easy to create a pass-fail test for a code compliance. There's you have a skipped content link or you don't have a skipped content link. But writing and language itself is a mess of context and judgment, and so it suffers from easy, strict compliance tests. And honestly, that may be really the biggest threat that faces editorial accessibility today, is that the guidelines downplay their importance because there's no easy way to measure or judge compliance. So while most of the well-known editorial and language-focused accessibility requirements sit at a double A level, they're typically judged not for their content, but for their presence. So you can test whether alt text is present with a yes or no, but it's much harder to test for effectiveness. You can say, yes, there's a caption on this video, but you cannot simply just say, yes, this writing is plain and clear. And so writing, which is the messiest thing that any web practitioner will ever dive into, honestly, is usually given a compliance level of AAA. And while this is not a dig at WCAG, it's just a note on the difficulty of judging editorial content. It's honestly unrealistic to legally require content to be written into a specific level because there's no legal way to judge what that specific level is one way or the other. And then GEO showed up. And the practice of writing and structuring our content for AI, which kind of goes through it goes by a few names. It feels like we've landed on GEO, generative engine optimization. So whenever someone asks a question in Google's AI overview or Perplexity or Claude or whatever decides whether your page is a useful answer, that decision is based on comprehension. The AI has to understand what the page is about before it can really decide if that page is useful. And here is what people who are working in GEO are finding, independent of anything the accessibility community has ever been saying, and that AI systems appear to favor pages where the topic and intent are obvious early. Clear headings that describe content rather than marked locations. The main point arrives before several sentences of setup, and there's a context sentence that establishes who the page is for and what it answers before any of the detail begins. And that is strikingly similar to the list that accessibility practitioners have been working from for years. And this isn't a coincidence. It's the same underlying truth that's really approached from two directions. Content that makes readers work to find the meaning is content that doesn't work. Whether the reader is a screen reader user or an AI system or a human who's skimming a page on their phone. The interesting thing about all this is that GEO and it isn't that accessibility and GEO agree. What's interesting is that they agree because they're both right about something that was always true. Which means that practically you now have two independent bodies of evidence that are pointing at the same writing practices. So when you're in a room or arguing for better headings and the response is like, we don't have capacity for an accessibility overhaul right now, you can also say these same patterns are what AI search visibility rewards. These are the same changes. You're not asking for something extra. You're asking for something that the organization already wants. And the path there is ultimately identical. So I want to spend, I guess, the rest of this time to sort of get concrete about those patterns, and specifically those three content patterns I mentioned that really they create the core of accessible and GEO friendly content. First is headings. So this is how we label the sections within each article. Next is the lead to each section, how we introduce each section in the body below those headings. And then finally is context, or providing a context sentence, which is how we introduce the entire page itself. And as we go through these, think about a page of copy from your work, pull it up while I'm talking, review it with these three patterns in mind. We're not going to share anything out, so don't worry. It is too early for me to do group exercises, but You don't have to worry about coming with solutions. Consider some of the stuff though that you might do to get that page ready, both for editorial accessibility and for GEO readiness. And first, let's look at headings. Uh, the biggest note on this, first of all, is that your headings are not labels. They are navigation. Every heading on your page is a decision point for somebody who isn't reading linearly. A screen reader user tabbing through headings is asking, is this the section I need? A person scanning on a phone is asking the same thing. So an AI trying to understand what your page cover is doing the same thing as those two human users. The principle here is really simple. A heading should tell you what you're about to learn and not where you are in the document. So, for example, something like "Our approach" is a heading that's focused on labeling the section instead of helping a user understand what they will see. While a reader will know, like read this and say, okay, well, this section is about the approach, they won't know whether that approach is worthwhile to them through these two simple words. On the other hand, and guilty right here because I do this all the time, sometimes people will use these headings to get creative. So in some sense, this might add like an element of whimsy to the article, like this is where the magic happens. But neither of these are actually helpful from an accessibility side because it does not help streamline the reading process. Remember that the effort to read something increases as we add barriers. Whether that's language or disability or device. And so instead of labeling the section, we should describe what's coming next. So if we say something like every project begins with a content audit, we are essentially saying the same thing as those other two, but we're being very clear. We're telling them what they're about to learn. And that's really the difference between a label and a heading. And the test I use for this is to skip every word of body copy on the page and read only the headings. Do they help you understand the scope of the article? After reading them, do you have a better idea of where to find information? If not, the headings aren't doing their job, and neither screen reader nor AI comprehension can compensate for that. So this is a blog post I wrote for the now defunct Contents magazine like a decade ago about how to create a content strategy methodology. And when you read these subheads, the H2s, you can see a natural progression of what this article was about. You can see that we defined it, we talked about why it matters, we talked about what it means to create your own methodology, and then just how to create the methodology. You can easily scan this. The headings are making promises that they can keep in the body copy, and now somebody using a screen reader can skip through skip through the headings to find their way around the article. Next, let's look at the lead. The lead is the first sentence of a section or a page, and the principle here is that meaning comes before explanation every time. The instinct that most writers have is to warm up, to set the scene, to establish context, to acknowledge complexity, and then to make the point. And there are places where that works. A good story, you have this kind of lead up, or a really careful argument, but in most web content, that warm up is invisible to the reader. By the time the actual point arrives in like sentence 4 or 5, a screen reader user navigating efficiently has likely already moved on, and an AI parsing the page has spent most of its attention on setup rather than actual like substance. So here's a example of a paragraph that's designed to say essentially we help write content. And as we can see here, the first 2/3 of the paragraph are dedicated to like this wind up to saying we're about to tell you what we're going to tell you. And even when we actually reach that sentence, we come at the idea of we help write content by talking about the length of time and a generic idea of approach. And it takes us 2/3 of the paragraph to allude to the fact that we help write content. And the fix is to really invert it, to lead with the point, and then support that point after. This is the classic example of the inverted pyramid, which we learn in high school when we learn about journalism. The most important information comes first, with context and detail coming after that. And what this does, in addition to all these other things, is it respects our readers' time. They get to know early on whether to commit to the rest of this content, and that's true for humans. And based on research so far, that's also true for AI. Due to essentially the limited memory of most LLMs right now, storing the most important information first leads to better retention of that information. Now, does this mean that warm-up sentences are the worst? No, it doesn't, but it's, like with any writing thing, writing's hard to measure. And this is one of those places. But it's also worth remembering that no matter the audience, the longer we wait to get to the point, the worse our writing is going to come across. And finally, let's talk about providing context through a context sentence or a context paragraph. So when a human or robot lands on a page, they want to know what this page is about. And while meta titles can often do this, meta titles are sometimes hidden or truncated. So the idea of a context sentence or paragraph uses real content in a normal place to tell the reader who this page is for and what problems it solves. And it's really easy to want to cut this copy in the name of like brevity. So when you're reviewing copy, you see that context sentence and you say, okay, we already explained this stuff later. But I urge you to resist. Don't get rid of these intro paragraphs. So here's an example. As you can see here, this is from Social Security in the United States. There's nothing summarizing this page. We immediately dive in to eligibility, and with no context sentence, it's really hard to tell what else might be on this page. A human or screen reader or AI agent that lands on your page from a search result or from an internal link, they have to work backwards from the detail to figure out if they're even in the right place. A better example is this one sentence at the top of the page or section. So this is applying for a UK passport. This is something that names the audience, it names the situation, or names the problem, one of those things. And in this example, that sentence is as clear as, use this service to apply for, renew, replace, or update your passport and pay for it online. It tells a screen reader user whether this page is for them, while also giving a bot enough grounding to match the page to like a relevant query. And that's about as simple as it is, although we know that all of this stuff I said is actually really, really deceptively hard. We know it's really deceptively hard because this stuff requires buy-in and it still requires budget. And so how do we get those things? First, know that the argument for better and more accessible writing is always really sound. It's a sound argument. It's always been sound, and we all know it's the right thing to do. But unfortunately, most organizations are corporate or capitalism forward, which means the argument of we should do this because it's the right thing is not always a winning argument. So writing for accessibility tends to continue to be deprioritized. And so instead of a priority, honestly, it's seen as a stretch goal. And while stretch goals are created out of good intentions, the reality is that if something is given a lower priority within a busy web design practice, it might as well not be prioritized at all. What GEO gives us is a second entry point into the same conversation, where we can suddenly play to the same frustrations to shape the argument within our corporate or capitalism forward organizations, and we can position this as AI search visibility is improved through better writing. This is a much more profitable way to frame the argument than we should do this because it is the right thing to do. And this is not a moral commentary on those rooms. It is just how organizational priorities work. And we have to be pragmatic about it. We can really build an argument for more accessible writing when we can build it as an argument for both usability and visibility. One is very hard to measure. One is very top of mind and honestly probably causing a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. So once the writing conversation gets started, for whatever reason, the habits that form really serve every reader, and that's the outcome that we're after. And most importantly, we are not giving anything up by using GEO or AI as an argument, because the content that GEO rewards is the content that accessibility requires. So you're not trading one goal for another. You're using ultimately a new road to get to the same destination. And I have one important caveat before we wrap this up, and I do say this out loud when you're using GEO as a lever in these situations, and that is that GEO is not a replacement for accessibility work. GEO does not get you alt text, it does not get you keyboard navigation, it does not give you color contrast or ARIA labels or focus management or any of those things that require deliberate expertise that GEO interest does not automatically produce. What GEO covers writing clarity and content structure and honest language is a meaningful slice of accessibility work, specifically that editorial layer that we talked about earlier. And most importantly, it's an added level of accessibility that isn't already covered by the traditional WCAG AA requirements or traditional accessibility testing tools. So while we still need to have deep conversations about accessibility in general, using GEO in this way helps strengthen the accessibility work that we are already doing. And this is great because until this point, we have been Johnny Cash. We've been making the case for clear writing and honest headings and content that respects the reader for a very, very long time. And we've been right about it, and the work has been good. But unfortunately, we've also sat in a lot of rooms where it didn't move the needle. And so GEO is our Rick Rubin. It showed up from a completely different direction, no interest in accessibility, looked at our content and said, this is exactly what we need. Clear headings, plain language, context before detail. Not because it cares about screen reader users, but because it turns out that those things are just what good content looks like. And AI search needs good content to function. And that's really our opening. We should use it to get the writing conversation started in rooms where it has not started yet, to make the case for editorial accessibility as something that serves both human readers and AI systems. And we don't give up anything by doing it because the content that GEO rewards is the content we've always been fighting for. So bring these into your next accessibility or AI search or general content review, your next editorial conversation, your next proposal for why writing quality deserves a seat at the table. Because ultimately we've been right about this for a really long time, and it's really, really good to finally have some company. So go do amazing things with this information. Good luck, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey. Round of applause. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of the geo link to accessibility in that way. So yeah, it's good. And I like the practical examples as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.